So John is going to talk to us about collusion, barriers to adjustment, and the welfare impact of OPEC. John, the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Let me reiterate what Volker said, how disappointed I am not to not be there. Tuesday, when I had to pull the plug an hour before the plane was due to depart, was not a banner day. But with that in mind, it's a pleasure to be here today at 4 a.m. at LA time, noon your time. And I'm deeply cognizant of the fact I'm keeping you from lunch. So let's get on with it. What I'm going to talk about today is something that has become more topical than we anticipated it would be, which is to say the world oil market. Let me be very clear right from the beginning that the analysis that I'm going to present today is from 1970 to 2014. So it doesn't relate directly to, much of the complications that are happening in the global supply chain at the moment as a consequence of the desperately tragic humanitarian crisis that's unfolding to the east of you. Anyway, before I get into the guts of it, what I want to do is to just step back a little bit and think about how we think about cartels, and in particular, well, more generally, actually, models of market power in both empirical and theoretical settings in IO. So, when I think about sort of canonical approaches to measuring and modeling market power, and particularly cartels empirically, I think about there being basically two approaches. One is, a fairly typical kind of job market approach, which would be to estimate a demand curve with the purpose of inferring some elasticity, and then combining that elasticity with a model of firm conduct to back out a latent parameter, which is usually a marginal cost, and then do something. How big was the cartel relative to cartel's impact relative to some competitive benchmark or something like that. The key point there is you have a behavioral assumption, and the nature of the assumption is such that to the extent you can think about welfare, it's typically focused on what I'll call deadweight loss, which is the loss gains from trade due to some quantum of output not being produced. Right, and that's typically a consequence of assuming, some significant homogeneity in marginal costs across firms. An alternative is to come at industries through the supply side, whether that's estimating a cost function or a production function, and then think about how, some change in industry structure might have affected the distribution of output across productive units. And here, you're explicitly thinking about how much would the resource cost of production have changed if you could shift production around. Typically, what you're doing is you're holding production levels at the aggregate fixed, which means that you don't have a deadweight loss in that thing. So, if you think about classic papers like Ollie Pecos, which you can think of as sort of a merger in reverse, that very much is in this spirit. So that's the empirical side, right? Where, typically we're a little bit limited in how we can do a full welfare analysis by virtue of the, data environment and consequently the methods we can employ. Theoretically, at least when I teach undergraduate IO or just trying to form some intuitions in my head, I'm also often throwing out at least productive inefficiency, because a typical theoretical sandbox would have firms with the same marginal costs for good analytical reasons for many of the questions we're interested in. So there's two things about this. Well, let me say three, perhaps. First, all of these sort of limits that we place on models mean that we're often not giving ourselves the full technology required to think about welfare correctly. The second is that, we lean very hard on, at least in the empirical context, what is a usually heroic assumption about the applicability of a behavioral model to observed conduct. And if you've studied cartels, you appreciate that, cartels are not usually organized in particularly clean ways. And then the last thing is, and this will be a big issue in this industry, is that we tend to, think about market power without thinking about other distortions that may be affecting the market, which, at least in the context of oil, turns out to be a relatively big deal. So with that sort of broad thematic introduction, let me talk about what I am going to do. So in this paper, we introduce an empirical framework which allows us to get at both productive inefficiency, which is to say, given a level of output, the extent to which observed outcomes are increasing the resource cost on the economy relative to some social planner solution. And also the perhaps more familiar deadweight loss, which is to say the loss gains from trade from output that wasn't produced. Our focus, as I said, is going to be on OPEC. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, we know that OPEC is a cartel because they admit to it. The second is that it's really big with genuine macro impacts. And this is a large part of why we're doing this. The bottom line numbers in this paper are going to be measured in the trillions. And, part of the reason for doing this paper is to, push back on people who think that in IO, we measure things in units of yogurt. Here, the numbers are going to be big enough that even our macro colleagues might pay attention to them. And there's going to be some other aspects which are important, other distortions, and also because it's a finite resource, the dynamics of extraction are going to be important and introduce some dynamics that need to be taken care of, but which, for what we're doing at least, are sort of second order in the basic economics. Much of what allows us to do all of this is very, very, very detailed cost and resource data on both marginal and inframarginal units of production. And it's that data resource that is going to allow us to take a somewhat different approach than what might normally be the case in much of the typical empirical IO toolbox. So let me just quickly talk about themes again. The first thing that this line of work does is to contribute to the literature on the extent to which cartels and market power more generally impose costs on the economy. It's actually surprising how little well-measured work has been done on this basic measurement exercise. For a long time, I've thought about what if I was asked to testify in front of US Congress or in front of the EU Parliament or somewhere like that, and someone asked the pointed question, how much does antitrust enforcement benefit the average consumer? It's a question which we have some strong intuitions about and have some good measurement relating to, but there's a lot more work we could do here. And in particular, until at least recently, I've been cognizant of the fact that the general presumption amongst people who think about economic aggregates, in other words, our macro colleagues, has been that, IO is important when you're thinking about an individual field, industry, but for thinking about aggregate outcomes may be second order. And it's to this end that thinking about an industry like OPEC, where the punchline is going to be that distortions in net present value terms between 1970 and 2014 were in the order of $6 trillion, is enough to sort of at least push against this presumption that even in the aggregate, this stuff can be approximated by a competitive model. The second thing we're going to do here is take sort of other distortions seriously and, you know, think about the old theory of the second best stuff, a la Lipsey and Lancaster. And much of the reason for this is because it will give us an insight into the extent to which the capacity for OPEC to impose costs on the world is a consequence of distortions elsewhere in the market, and in particular with respect to the potentially competitive fringe. What we'll be arguing is that if the fringe was actually able to behave in a somewhat approximately competitive way, OPEC would really have very little power in the upstream oil market. And there's some, you know, I've already talked about relationships to sort of, you know, the macro market power debate, which has emerged in the last couple of years. If this isn't something you paid attention to, I thoroughly recommend you having a look at what the macro guys are doing to think about the impact of IO in the aggregate. It's both exciting and frightening or challenging, and it's something, you know, that we as IO economists should be paying even more attention to, because if they're going to do it anyway, so it should be informed by all the great work we've done over the last 20, 30, 40 years. So, you know, with that long introduction, let me get into the guts of oil a bit. I'm actually going to first do some basic undergraduate welfare economics to give you a sense of what exactly we're doing in the economic objects of interest. And then what I'm going to do is talk about oil, quickly just talk about the technical side of what we're doing, and then show you the results and what they mean for economics. So that's where we're going. So let's get on with it. So what I want to posit is just a very simple static model for the moment to get intuitions right. So I want to think about a dominant group of firms which will form a cartel, all of whom have constant marginal costs and with a group capacity constraint that's you know, equal to some Q. And then I'm going to think about there being a fringe of alternative producers, and that fringe, just for convenience, is going to have marginal costs that are higher than the cartel, right? And this is going to be a model without any product differentiation. So one might think that such a model could look like this. So you have constant marginal costs here. This is our cartel production. This is the maximum amount they could produce, and here's the fringe. Downward sloping demand and all that good stuff. So this is what a competitive outcome or a social planner outcome might look like. Now, a cartel, of course, makes money by withholding supply to the market and so driving up price. And so what we might observe actually in data would look like this, right? So, you know, here's the familiar overcharge from the cartel. And you'll notice that a bunch of the production that is withheld from the market by the cartel is taken over by the fringe, albeit at a much higher resource cost to the economy. So the welfare objects here are first, you know, a familiar deadweight loss and also a productive inefficiency. So collectively, the total loss gains from trade are the deadweight loss, the solid gray area, and then the hatched gray area, which is the productive inefficiency, or, you know, the increase in resource cost of engaging in production. Okay, so that's in this model, at least, the welfare cost of cartel activity. Now, from a measurement point of view, what would we need to work out all these triangles? Well, we need a demand curve, right? Yeah, that's familiar territory. We need to know what the market equilibrium is, That's data. So the P and the aggregate Q. The thing that's usually not available to us, given typical data, is the marginal cost schedule. In other words, the supply curve that's realized in reality. And then the reason for that is we usually don't see the costs of production for inframarginal units, or at least we usually don't combine those with a demand curve. Here, we're going to have very, very granular data on oil fields all around the world. About the data set covers 98% of all operating oil fields, and it covers all of them that are of any significant production. So we're going to have a hope of mapping this out. So the last thing we're going to have to do is to work out what a social planner would do. In other words, we need to map out the counterfactual supply curve, which, if you follow my cursor, is this region here, right? And if we have all of those objects, then we can map out these triangles. Now, the key innovations methodologically are going to be utilizing inframarginal cost data to get the supply curve in reality. And then where theory is going to come in is going to be a model of the social planner to get this supply curve here. You'll notice that where I'm using theory is to get what a social planner solution would be. And I'm not going to try and model OPEC's particular behavior. This is a source of some considerable comfort to me, because if you read the history of OPEC, it's complicated. And so summarizing that into, say, a first order condition would be courageous. I have much more confidence that in my ability to write down what a social planner solution might look like, than my ability to model accurately the intricate institutional workings of OPEC and the rest of the global oil industry. So let me just pause here and note that if the only thing that was causing the oil industry to deviate from a competitive equilibrium was market power, would be done, right? But there's almost certainly other distortions in this market. Taxes, geopolitical issues, wild corruption in many countries, other things like that. So to do the evaluation of the impact of market power, we need to take that seriously. So in thinking about how to do this, I'm going to posit two approaches. One is to think about, given all the other distortions out there in the market, what's the marginal impact of market power? And that's a perfectly valid way to think about the impact of market power and as part of the total distortion in the market. An alternative, which I think is equally reasonable, is to say, absent all other distortions, what's the impact of market power? And this is the first I'm going to call marginal effect. This last one, the one that's absent all other distortions, I'll call inframarginal. Now, and this is where we intersect with the theory of the second best, right? And should be familiar that when you have multiple distortions in a market, their cumulative effect need not be additive because they interact with each other. And that's going to be the case here, right? So to get economically meaningful measures of the impact of market power in the presence of other distortions, these two approaches are going to be complementary, right? Let me show you what they mean. So here's the way you would construct the marginal impact of market power. What you would do is to take the world as we see it. Here's the observed supply curve. And then say, well, what if the cartel was actually operated by the social planner And then the supply curve of the fringe, with all its necessary distortions, was taken as is, right? So the fringe keeps whatever distortions they have, and the cartel operates competitively. So that would produce a deadweight loss measure and a productive inefficiency measure, and would tell you, given the distortions elsewhere in the market, how much incrementally is market power adding to distortions. In the alternative, the inframarginal approach would be to say, hold the cartel's activity constant. Right? So if the cartel were producing this amount, hold that constant, and then get rid of all the other distortions in the market. So we'd be rotating the fringe's supply curve downwards, and it would be the difference between this new supply curve here and the unconstrained social planner problem, which would be the measure of what I'm going to call inframarginal welfare loss, the extent to which market power in the absence of any other distortion would be causing a welfare loss. Okay, so those two approaches, the marginal approach and the inframarginal approach, are going to be our two metrics for welfare loss. Right. So with that set up, let me quickly explain the application and then talk about results and the economics that's underlying them. So let me give you a very quick introduction to the world oil industry. You know, the oil industry is characterized by having this cartel in the middle of it, which is OPEC. And the key members of OPEC are going to be the Gulf states, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And then they have a bunch of other countries which are members, but which are less strategically important. So, you know, OPEC is very much an imperfect cartel. Like most cartels in practice, it operates more as a dysfunctional family than as, you know, a jointly optimizing anything very much. But it does have a significant impact on the market at times. And it's easy to understand why, because 50% of the world's reserves are held in OPEC, but the rate of extraction in OPEC is about half that in the rest of the world. So OPEC has half the oil and extracts it at about half the rate. It's worth keeping in mind, let me say that, you know, the three biggest producers globally are Saudi, the US, and Russia, with, you know, depending on the year, between 10 and 15% of global production each. OPEC helpfully admits to being a cartel. So this is just a quote from their 2017 statement, where they admit that, you know, their purpose was to secure fair and stable pricing for petroleum producers, which is a typical way for a cartel to explain what they're doing in, you know, sort of friendly terms. Let me now talk about the data and then show you some summary stats. So the way we're going to handle the data, let me say, mirrors an earlier paper we wrote about oil, which appeared in the AER in 2019. The data is from a company called Rystad, which is a Norwegian company that, you know, sells a data product to pretty much anyone who's a serious player in the oil industry, and it's that data product we're going to utilize. What they have in that data set is data on about 66,000 oil fields, of which about 19,000 have produced crude oil in the time period that we're looking at. So, you know, 1970 to 2014. So a field is a pretty disaggregated thing. So if you ever come to LA and you drive from LA airport to UCLA, you will go past one of the oil fields in this data set. There's a hill about a third of the way on that route that has oil derricks all over it, and you see them producing routinely. So for each field, it has annual production, it has line item costs, sort of development costs, CapEx, SG&A, things like that. Very detailed information on reserves, on the technology that's being used, actually a lot of geological information, and the location of the deposit. Okay, so with that data, what we can do is to work out cost per barrel at different fields. And I'm going to show you a bunch of these graphs. I'm going to switch to one about Saudi to explain to you what it all means. And then, you know, I'll show you some of this stuff. So on the vertical axis here is dollars per barrel, right? This thick black line is the oil price in 2014 dollars. So you can see that in the early 80s, it spikes in the oil crises, comes back down in the late 80s. Here's the Asia crisis of the late 1998. This is an unfortunate incident where contemporaneously with Asia going into recession, OPEC decided to expand output and messed up prices. In this period here, OPEC actually cooperated with Russia and Norway to withhold supply and stabilize prices. And then, you know, here you can see where the global economy starts going nuts and then slows down in the 2008 crisis and then starts revving up again. Now, these gray and black bars are where the action is. And let me explain to you what they're about. So if I might direct your attention to here, 1982, what the black bar covers is the interval in which sits the middle 90% of cost of barrel. So the bottom of the black is the cost of the 5th percentile barrel from Saudi Arabia in that year. And the top of the black is not the 95th percent cost barrel. And gray is just from 1% to 99%. So by looking at the black or the gray, you can see the span of cost per barrel that fields in Saudi Arabia incurred in that year. And forget about the dots. So if you compare the band of costs in Saudi Arabia to the oil price, you can see why Saudi princes drive around in private jets, right? They're making a hell of a lot of money. These are cheap deposits. By the way, what's going on in 1970, the top of the gray is determined by some capex that was incurred on an offshore field that was being developed that finished at the end of the year. So there was very little production, but quite a bit of cost. Now, if I might go back, on this slide, there's the same pictures, but I've divided countries into non-OPEC on your left and OPEC on your right, right? And you can see that, you know, generally OPEC tends to have slightly lower costs than non-OPEC countries. You know, the big producers like Saudi have significantly lower costs. So again, here's Saudi. If I might compare that to the US, that's what the US looks like. So the US has some low cost deposits in Texas and off some of the southern states in shallow offshore deposits. But it also has some very expensive deposits, which are typically the shale, unconventional stuff that's been developed in recent years. Because it's mildly topical, I might also show you what Russia looks like. So this is the cost of Russian oil, you know, from 1970 to the present day. And you can see that much of Russia's oil deposits are relatively low cost. They're not as low cost as Saudi, but they're similar. And it's no accident that in the order of, you know, 30 to 40%, depending on how you measure it, 30 to 40% of Russian government revenues come from royalties on oil and gas, right? So this is a significant source of revenue for the Russian government. Russia's not alone in this regard. You know, Saudi obviously gets a lot of government revenues from oil. Nigeria, their government, my recollection is that it's something in the order of 75% of government revenues come from oil royalties. So, once you understand this, it's no accident that you would see, in previous years, Putin go down to Saudi Arabia to make sure he's on good terms with the king down there. And one conjectures that the reason for that is that if Saudi turned on the taps, that would significantly undermine the capacity of the Russian government to do anything. So with that sort of overview of kind of the cost dispersion in production in this industry and some of the big players, let me turn a little bit more to measurement. The big issue, as a technical matter in handling our application oil is that it's a finite resource, which means that when you extract something today, you can't produce it tomorrow. To take that seriously, the underlying model needs to have some dynamics in it, which introduces notational horror, but really just has a small change to intuition, which is to say that to the extent there are distortions, they change from not if something's produced, but to when something's produced. So if I don't produce oil in my oil field today, that gives me the option to produce it tomorrow or perhaps the day after. Okay. So distortions are fundamentally a function of discounting once you have this set up, right? So to the extent that I value today more than I value tomorrow, that's going to increase the cost of delaying production and consumption. As a secondary matter, there's also a little bit of theory work to make sure that the way we're handling cost data is coherent such that it has a basis for economic interpretation. So there's a little bit of sort of production function stuff to do here. I'm going to skip a lot of the technicality here because those static pictures I showed you of welfare stuff is where the action is, but I'm going to go fast here just to give you a rough sense of sort of the moving parts. Let me begin first by just saying the assumptions we're going to make that allow us to handle the cost data. We're going to assume that oil is homogeneous. At the level of aggregation that we're dealing with it, that's probably not a horrible assumption, but if you were thinking about short-term oil market movements, that would definitely be something you would be worried about. We're also going to assume that there's a common discount factor. This is mainly to give the social planner some time cost. The next thing is we're going to assume at the field level in a given year, so the marginal costs are such that the marginal cost of a field in year T is equal to some field constant, that's this, and then some technology year shifter, this mu. And we're going to assume that that mu evolves over time according to a martingale assumption. So with these four things, this basically means that a social planner is going to want to extract low cost reserves first and high cost reserves later. So it turns a dynamic problem into something that's going to feel very static. There's a lot of text on this slide. Let me just tell you quickly what it means. For the dynamics, you need to think a little carefully about what loss gains from trade are, productive inefficiency is, and deadweight loss. In the interest of time, I'm going to just move through this because the intuitions from the static model are sufficient for what I want to do here today. And this is just in the spirit of crossing T's and dotting I's. When I talk about a social planner problem in this context, what the social planner problem is going to do is seek to maximize the net present value of gains from trade, right? And So in a world with some dynamics, that's going to be a function of discounting and also the demand and cost parameters. And the formalism of setting this up is very notationally heavy. So I'm merely going to give it to you in words to give you a sense of the thing and save you some formal headache. Let me just quickly sketch the mechanics then of how we calibrate the modeling framework. As we noted earlier, what we need is a measure of inframarginal costs and a demand curve. So inframarginal costs are going to be given by the empirical analog of the equation that I showed you earlier, which is to say that marginal costs are going to be composed of a field constant, a technology year shifter, and just some measurement error. And so this is going to be estimated using sort of a very crude brute force panel data approach that follows our earlier work. Demand is a little more interesting. We model demand using a linear demand curve, right? So quantities demanded is going to be a function of price and some obvious shifters, including just some time trends. What we are going to do is to cap demand at $200. The reason is that beyond that capped level, we're really not sure what the world looks like. So rather than have model predictions be a function of assumptions which are less than transparent, here we're just going to be brutal with the model, and at least then you can see or appreciate what's going on. I suspect by the end of this year we could well see the cost per barrel go comfortably over $200. So we may adjust this. I should say that we sat down about 2 weeks ago to work out what would happen to the long run oil price if Russian production was withheld for a significant period of time. And it's not crazy to think that a price per barrel of $250 is likely. So when we estimate a demand curve, we want to think about how we do it. And the reason's pretty clear, because this is just the data cloud for prices on the vertical, quantity on the horizontal for each year in our data set. And if you stick a straight line through this, you're going to get an upward sloping demand curve, which is pretty clear indication that you have an endogeneity problem. Now, the way to solve this is to get a cost shifter. And happily here, because we have very good cost data, we can see how cost curves shift. So we can construct almost exactly the instrument you want, which is to say, we look at the changes over time of the cost of producing an inframarginal barrel. In other words, we compare a year where this barrel cost this much, and this barrel, the same barrel in some other year would have had a higher price. And we take that to indicate whether supply curves have significantly shifted. So with that instrument, which is almost a direct observation of a cost shifter, we can estimate a linear demand curve and get on with it. So to give you a sense of what comes out the other end, let me just show you the elasticities. The thick black line is the elasticity of oil demand at the annual level over the time of our data. And it bounces around between -0.1 and -0.3. So we have very inelastic demand. And as you would expect, it moves around as the oil price moves around. Because it's a linear demand curve. So let me say these estimates are in line with other work as well. Now, the last thing we need to do is to just posit a few other things to close the model. Because the underlying machinery has a dynamic aspect to it, we need a discount rate. So we're just going to use 0.95 for no particularly good reason, other than that's a pretty typical discount rate to use for applied economics work. We're going to limit the amount of oil that can be extracted from a field in any given year. And we cap the extraction rate at 10% of reserves for a field, or higher if we ever observe a field extracting at a higher rate. Following what might be thought of as common sense, we say that you can only extract oil from a field after it's been discovered. The economic assumption underlying that is that the path of new discoveries are taken as exogenous. The last thing we need to do is to think about what to do with the data after 2014 when our data ends. So what we do there is we assume that in reality, sort of the actual path reverts to a social planner solution, taking the state of the world at the end of 2014 as an initial condition. That's clearly not real, but really what it's doing is giving us a sense of a continuation value for a set of calculations that are going to be NPV'd back to 1970. So to the extent that matters, you need to think about it as being multiplied by, 0.95 to the power of 45. So it's, what we do there doesn't matter a whole lot, but it's, something we need to close out the model. So that's just, sort of the last bits of the calibration. So let me now just show you results. I'm going to show you just one table of results because this is sort of the punchline, and it's going to have a bunch of economics underlying it. So what we find when we run all of this machinery is that the impact in net present value terms from 1970 through 2014 of distortions in the oil market is substantial. So if we look at lost gains from trade, right? In other words, and here I'm going to so in other words, this, right? The shaded area here, the composite here. This loss gains from trade, without trying to decompose it into market power or other distortions yet, this constitutes $6 trillion in NPV terms. Okay, so that's 2014 dollars that NPV'd over 45 years. The total cost of distortions in the oil market is $6 trillion. Okay. So here's the 6 trillion I'm talking about. Now, we need to recognize that there's other distortions in this market aside from OPEC's market power. The reason we know that is, first, casual observation, but second, if you look at the production that's occurring in the rest of the world, it's inconsistent with any social planner solution. In other words, you have production in the Permian Basin in West Texas, which costs about $6 a barrel. At the same time as you see production in the North Sea or even higher cost places, which is 10 times more expensive than that, right? And reconciling concurrent production with those cost differences is very, very contradicts our notion of what a competitive solution would be in this, in both the model we're using and the industry. So as a consequence, we're going to do the decomposition using the inframarginal approach first. Okay. So if you think about just let me switch back and remind you what that is. When we do the inframarginal approach, we're holding OPEC's conduct constant and then getting rid of distortions everywhere else to get this supply curve, and then comparing it to an unconstrained social planner. And when we do that, the amount that you would attribute to market power over the 45 years of our data is about $700 billion in NPV terms, which is substantially less than the 6 trillion in total welfare loss that we compute. Okay. Now, the other way to do it is what we call the marginal approach, which is to say we let the social planner control OPEC's resources and we take the distortions in the rest of the world as given. And if we do that, the magnitude of the shaded area here is in the order of 5.7 trillion, which is to say more than 85% of the total distortions in the market. So let me switch back to our little table. So what I want to draw your attention to is the total loss gains from trade in the market. And then, the relative magnitudes of the inframarginal approach, which is about 12% of the total, and the marginal approach, which is north of 85% of the total, right? And I want you to, the interesting economics lies in reflecting why you should get such different decompositions depending on the approach that's taken and what that tells you about the market. So, obviously there's a large welfare loss here. It's a pleasure to write an IO paper where the headline is in trillions. Now, the marginal approach being, 5.7, which is close to total welfare loss, implies a large quantity distortion from the cartel, right? When the social planner can control OPEC's production, it increases OPEC's production a lot. So, that large marginal number fundamentally is a function of a quantity of distortion. The inframarginal number reflects, in fact, it's small relative to the total welfare loss. Implies that when the rest of the world is able to act competitively, when you get rid of their distortions, they're able to mitigate much of the harm that is imposed on the world by OPEC, right? Taken together, what these two numbers indicate, the relative size of this 700 to, 5.7 trillion is that much of what allows OPEC to have the significant impact on the market that it does is the inability of the fringe to quickly respond to output withholding, by the large Gulf producers. To give you a sense of it, here's a version of the pictures we've been looking at again and again. Here's the observed supply curve. Here's the component that we observe being produced by OPEC. When the rest of the world can act competitively, right? In other words, where it doesn't have distortions, even holding OPEC's production constant at observed levels, the fringe supply curve goes from something like this to something like this. Okay, this very flat thing here. And as you can see, that's going to have a significant impact on the extent to which anything done by OPEC actually affects market outcomes. That's what that sort of relatively low inframarginal welfare loss is reflecting. And that's the sense in which one of the takeaways here is that when doing this exercise, you realize very quickly that the lack of response by the fringe is what a large source of the market power that OPEC has. So let me sort of pause here and step back and say, what do I get out of this? Well, there's really two things that this line of work has suggested to me. First, importantly, it's not crazy to posit that the harm from collusive conduct, at least over the last 45 years in oil, is plausibly in the trillions. To give you a sort of a sense of scale here, when I think it was Tom Sargent tried to work out the cost of a business cycle, it was in the order of a couple of trillion. So OPEC over the course of 45 years have imposed the same cost on society as one cycle of the business cycle has on the US. That seems like a big number. It's certainly helpful to me to have this number in my mind when people ask me questions like, does industrial structure and conduct matter? I think the answer, well, this helps you answer that question in the affirmative. Second, and this is sort of perhaps more policy relevant, what comes out of this is a helpful reminder that cartels and other forms of market power can be sustained by distortions introduced by other policy initiatives. So I'm being a little unfair here. It's clear there are distortions in the rest of the world. Where they come from is something we're still trying to shed some light on. But reflections suggest that at least some of it is things like taxation. We've talked to producers in Mexico, for instance, and some of the government policies about how they direct the activity of their nationalized oil company is startlingly inefficient. All of this suggests that it may be worth it, thinking about, if I were a competition agency, for instance, whether there are things that other parts of the government have done that might be limiting the ability of competitors to respond to cartel activity, or things that might be done to facilitate entry, such that cartels that we are non-actionable or we can't see still feel significant competitive pressure, and the harm is mitigated. One of the interesting things about this exercise is that you can get rid of the vast majority of OPEC's impact by increasing the flexibility of the fringe in their ability to respond to supply withholding. And it makes one wonder whether these kind of mitigation efforts may have a similar return to direct enforcement. So with that as at least what I see as the punchlines, let me stop and hand it back to Volker, and happy to take any questions or comments.
Well, thank you very much, John, for this very clear and impressive talk. So we still have time for a few questions. Yossi. Just a sec. There's going to be a microphone so that we and also John hopefully can hear your question.
Okay. So this is very interesting, but I was thinking that, maybe the higher prices of oil could be viewed as a sort of Pigovian tax, which pushes, market participants to become more fuel efficient. And actually, it can help the environment. So maybe there are mitigating benefits that need to be taken into account in order to assess the harm.
Absolutely. Like, so, you know, as you picked up on, we've explicitly decided not to engage in you know, that, although we totally agree with your economics. Where we actually sat down and did the back of the envelope on this. And near as we can guess, you know, if you think of fairly typical carbon tax maps into about $40 a barrel in tax. If you took OPEC out, you probably have to come close to doubling your implicit carbon tax on a barrel of oil. So there's a sense in which OPEC is reinforcing a bunch of, you know, climate objectives. The one thing that you may object about is why the revenue from that tax should end up in Saudi Arabia, as opposed to doing a bunch of other stuff in a whole bunch more jurisdictions around the world that might actually, you know, benefit folks who don't already have their own private jet.
Okay, other questions? Or actually, while others might think about questions, let me ask you one. So you assume that the non-OPEC producers are price takers, they're fringe. Now, you know, in some cases, as in the case of Russia, for instance, you might think that Russia also actually has market power. But of course, I guess for your decomposition, it's kind of mattered quite a bit that, you know, that the fringe is not strategic. So when we think about, for instance, taking away market power from OPEC, distortion from the rest, you know, from the non-OPEC countries, you know, might be different magnitude. So would we think about that actually sort of, in a sense, we underestimate the distortion from OPEC by assuming that the fringes is competitive, or?
Yeah, so we're, you know, your question underpins the sense in which, you know, the measurement exercise here is a sort of a different mental approach from the typical IO thing. Let me go back to this. Now, here, to the extent there are distortions in the fringe, they simply are what they are, right? All I'm claiming is that they're not particularly related to OPEC's activity. And then when the social planner is taking over everyone's production, that's a theoretical benchmark, right? So one of the nice things about this approach is that I'm comparing the world with all its weird ugliness to something I can theoretically understand, right? And it may be that in the fringe, there's a bunch of distortion. In fact, we think there is, obviously. Some of it might be taxes, but, you know, market power on the part of Norway or Russia or anyone else would also be a distortion, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, when
except that you wouldn't have a supply curve of the fringe, I guess, right? So
yeah, I'm. Your point is well taken, and I'm being loose with language, but you know, it's what I need is the marginal cost of all units of realized production to generate this, right? So, you know, that's at a sort of I hesitate to call it methodology, but you can see how it differs from the standard line of attack in empirical work.
Sure.
Right? You know, the nice thing is that we're using theory to get at something that has a clear theoretical understanding, which is a social planner problem, right? That I can understand.
Okay, other question. I think Edu, do you want to?
Yeah, a related question is, I mean, this graph is already very good to see that. You have been assuming that the residual supply curve by the fringe is systematically more expensive, higher than the OPEC's marginal costs. So and upward sloping, of course. So what would happen if in the fringe there were in fact cheaper producers, like that is You showed us some of the numbers, like the US and some other areas, maybe in fact cheaper. So then you would have sort of to combine this nice picture with sort of piece it together with parts of the fringe kicking in earlier and maybe even OPEC kicking in very late with some of the reserves there.
Yeah, your intuition is spot on. So, your point is exactly right, because in reality, for instance, the fringe has significant production that's equal to or lower cost than meaningful production on the part of OPEC. That's what these pictures tell you, among other things. So the reason why I've used these simple pictures is to just give you quick intuition. Let me show you what those pictures look like if you have, I think, what you have in mind, right? So this is the inframarginal effect. If this marginal cost schedule is for both the cartel and also the fringe, and it's the same picture essentially. It's just that it's more of an annoying accounting exercise. I'm happy to walk through it if you want, but the economics is no different. It's just a more annoying undergraduate problem set exercise. So perhaps send me an email if you want the full horror. But the intuitions are the same. The picture gets more complicated.
And I guess what matters in your empirical analysis, you take that into account, right? You have the data on.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Other questions? No, actually, Martin is telling me that we are running late, so I guess no more questions. Thanks so much, John. It was really great, right. Although, albeit only virtually, but it's we're all listening very, very carefully to what you had to say. So thanks so much for getting up so early. And
thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to seeing you next year in person.